Hi guys, so part two of our lecture, we're going to look at Black adaptation and resistance 1910 all the way up to 1948. So the ANC leaders, inspired by Chief Bambata, the anti-poll tax revolt in 1906. So the Bambata Rebellion of 1906 had an impact on some ANC leaders. It represented a significant moment of resistance against colonial rule. So despite the 200 years of war between colony and African tribes, there was still resistance burning in the national member. So, generations of African leaders were inspired by the Bambata Rebellion of 1906. In the years after the Anglo-Boer War, white colonialists in Natal were finding it more and more difficult to get black people to work on farms. So, the colonial authorities needed to create a reason for men to move away to seek work as paid laborers. So they insisted that black people must pay taxes. So this was expected to pressurize black men to work for white farmers in an attempt to earn money needed for the tax. So many Zulus resented these taxes. And then in 1906, a number of chiefs, amongst them Chief Bambata Kam Manxiza, head of the Zondi clan, decided to oppose the taxes. So he resisted British colonial rule against white domination and poll tax. He refused to pay poll tax introduced by the Natal government. Another reason I should mention is King Dinizulu kaCetshwayo succeeded Cetshwayo as king of the Zulu nation in 1884. So during 1906, Dinizulu became implicated in the anti-poll tax rebellion led by the chief Bambata. So he was arrested in 1909 and accused of harboring rebels. Dinizulu was sentenced to 4 years of imprisonment. Upon his release, he was banished to a farm in the Middelburg district, Eastern Transvaal, and he died in banishment in 1913. Hey? So the Bambata Rebellion had inspired many freedom fighters, and the memory of Bambata Rebellion and the courage displayed by Chief Bambata and his followers served as a symbol of resistance and resilience. Okay, so when we look at racially discriminatory provision of the Defense Act, so whites had a virtual monopoly of military weapons and training, right? And so the Defense Act of 1912 created an all-white active citizen force. So this act was meant to organize and regulate the country's military forces. It excluded non-white South Africans. In World War One, Black South Africans served in campaigns in Southwest Africa, East Africa, and Europe. And 5,635 Blacks lost their lives. Most notably, the 21,000 African members of the South African Native Labour contingent in France were employed as unarmed laborers. The exception was the Cape Corps, which consisted of white officers and colored other ranks, and was organized as a combatant unit of 18,000 in East African in the East African campaign. So Africans deeply resented the arming of the colored battalions. However, and at war's end, the government disbanded all black units and failed to recognize their service. I remember there's a documentary where someone in the ANC who served, I think they've died though now, they served in this army during this period. They literally did not the black people who served in this war. They went in literally with no arms. So three political organizations endeavored to improve the conditions of marginalized communities on a national scale. Colored organization, the African Political Organization APO, founded in 1902, an Indian organization, the South African Indian Congress, SAIC, which was founded in 1923, and the South African Native National Congress, later known as the African National Congress, founded in 1912. So the leaders of these three organizations were Western orientated middle class people, the products of the best schools available. Okay, so the founders of the ANC, Pixlika Isaka Seme, Alfred Mangena, Richard Msimang, and George Montau were mission educated Christians who had qualified as lawyers in England. So Seme, for example, had grown up on the American Mission Station in Natal, attended Mount Hermon School in Massachusetts, received a bachelor's degree from Columbia University, studied law at Oxford University, and been called to the British Bar in 1910. So in his keynote address to the founding conference of the ANC in Bloemfontein, Seme said, in the land of their birth, Africans are treated as hewers of wood and drawers of water. And he added, the white people of this country have formed what is known as the Union of South Africa, a union in which we have no choice in the making of laws and no part in their administration. We have called you, therefore, to this conference so that we can together devise ways and means of forming our national union for the purpose of creating national unity and defending our rights and privileges. So down to 1939 and beyond, the ANC remained under the control of, as you can see, lawyers, clergies, journalists who tried to elicit um, wide support to redress African grievances by constitutional means. Before I move to the slide, if you recall, I said earlier, after the 1913 Land Act, Blackie traveled to England in 1914 as part of a delegation, and in 1919 again, they sent another to Versailles to try and influence the peacemakers on their behalf by constitutional means. Okay, now the early organizations working together. So the colored and the Indian organizations were under similar middle class leadership and pursued corresponding goals for their people. So Abdullah Abdurham, president of APO, from 1905 until his death in 1940, was a doctor trained at Glasgow University. So the leaders of the SAIC were men such as P.R. Peffer, an estate and financial agent, Abdullah Ismail Kashia, a businessman. The APO made some not very successful efforts to cooperate with African leaders, but the SAIC concerned itself exclusively with the interests of Indian people. So in the 1920s and 1930s, members of all three organizations worked with such white liberals such as Edgar Brooks, who represented Africans as a senator under the legislation of 1936. Okay, so in and after 1921, liberals established a number of joint councils where small groups of white Africans, colored, and Asians met to discuss racial problems. And in 1919, they founded the South African Institute of Race Relations, which collected and published information about the effects of segregation and discrimination. So the ANC, APO, SAIC won no substantial victories, nor did they mobilize the black masses. By the 1930s, they were declining. Sporadic attempts were made to create more radical movements. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, the ICU. So now one of those remarkable organizations I was speaking about was the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, which began as a dock workers union. What began as a dock workers union became a national political movement. So the ICU began with a small meeting, mainly of Cape Town dockers on January 17, 1919, at which 24 members were enrolled. So following a strike on the docks, the movement spread like a wildfire throughout the country and even into neighboring countries to embrace 250,000 members of town and platteland. So Black African workers went on strike as early as 1893, and they first unionized in 1920 with the ICU. So the ICU was founded by Clement Kadali, a mission-educated African from Nyasaland, modern Malawi. So he was a mission-educated son of Askari chief. He qualified as a teacher at the age of 16. It was quite by chance that Kadali entered the trade union movement. He was an immigrant from Malawi. He worked at home as a teacher, then at various jobs in Mozambique, then Rhodesia and Cape Town, where he happened to meet A.F. Batty, a Labour Party candidate for the dock area, who persuaded him to begin organizing the non-European dockers. Nothing in Clement Kadali's background or outlook at that time could have marked him as a future leader of Africa's biggest workers' organization. So during its earlier years, the ICU adopted an extremely radical and militant policy, in many respects, a revolutionary policy. The ICU's message was one of working class internationalism, of militant anti colonialism, and anti racism. It was, in fact, not mainly Kadali himself, though he often gives the impression who molded the original ideological and organizational pattern of the ICU. So among the ICU's earliest members and most devoted leaders were the South African communists, who in 1917 had anticipated the ICU with the IWA, the Industrial Workers of South Africa. So Kadali himself pays tribute to the outstanding role played in the building of the ICU by such communists such as James Laguma, the General Secretary E.G. Kyle, Tim Becky, Johnny Gomez, and D. and Norman, many of whom were forced to resign in the witch hunt of 1926. So Kadali worked with veterans of the class and national liberation struggles who were armed with Marxist understanding. Their selfless devotion, their high level of political consciousness, and their collective experience of organization helped tremendously to make the ICU what it was. So by 1928, the ICU was a nationwide industrial and commercial workers union, claiming a membership of more than 150,000 Africans, 15,000 coloreds, and 250 whites. So during the 1920s, with the rise of the ICU, the urbanized working class began to acquire a sense of its own strength and power. So guys, the ICU was primarily a rural movement, tapping essentially African sharecroppers and tenant laborers. So the ICU swept along the rural areas and reached out to all powerless people. They promises of land repossession, their promises of land repossession and national liberation. So the ANC was overtaken by the more militant methods of Kadali. So the ANC was considered too moderate. They regarded the leaders of the ANC as the good boys and who were tied to the apron strings, they call it the apron strings of the white liberals. So there's an ANC veteran that once told the people, there's an ANC veteran who says that people were told to put some sort of a yellow card on the roofs by the ICU. And I think this stems from a story that Afro Americans were coming. It stems from a story that Afro Americans were coming with ships and planes to liberate South Africans and destroy all whites and black non believers. I think this was a method that was just used to persuade non black believers to join the ICU. So, sorry, to persuade black non-believers to the ICU. So there were many incidents that occurred through the Eastern Cape and Northern Transvaal where Africans refused to work. Um, they deserted. They stole livestock and destroyed property um, in rebellion. Okay, so as you can imagine, the ICU was becoming a pain for the apartheid government. Um, so white farmers and the government acted ruthlessly to suppress the ICU, harassing organizers and evicting troublemakers. So I'm going to play you a short clip of the destruction of the ICU hall in Durban in 1929. So the ICU leaders fought amongst themselves. They also became corrupt, unfortunately, and lost touch with the masses by the middle of the 30s, and the ICU was waning. That's something for you guys to think about. Something that happens with these movements where, you know, it's not just a today thing where these leaders in these movements they become corrupt and they lose touch with the masses. Gonna play a clip for you guys. The clip.
Kilo didn't have these cards.
At its peak, the ICU had 100,000 members. But strike action was met with strong repression by the government and by white civilians. By 1929, white fear enabled Herzog to win power on a black peril platform. The ICU was in decline.
Kilo didn't have these cards.
At its peak, the
Okay. So now we are going to look at the South African Communist Party. Okay. So during this period, the Communist Party began to Africanize for an independent Black republic. So it was the only political organization in South Africa that recruited members from all racial groups and had a multiracial executive. So this was the first political party where people of all races could belong. So few whites had broken away from the Labour Party and formed the International Associates League, and later in 1921, it was the Communist Party. So I'm going to read you something here. So, but like other communist parties outside the Soviet Union, it was subject to directives from Moscow, notably in 1928, when the Communist International ordered it to cease giving priority to the class struggle and adopt the slogan and analysis of an independent South African Native Republic or Black Republic, which threw the party into turmoil and led to schisms. So, what does this mean, guys? Let me read it again. But like other communist parties outside the Soviet Union, it was subject to directives from Moscow, notably in 1928, when the Communist International ordered it to cease giving priority to the class struggle and to adopt the slogan and analysis of an independent South African Native Republic or Black Republic, which threw the party into turmoil and led to schisms. So, what does this mean? So this is saying, similar to other communist parties operating beyond the Soviet Union, it faced directive from Moscow. For instance, in 1928, the Communist International instructed the party to abandon its focus, excuse me, to abandon its focus on class struggle and embrace or adopt a black republic. So they are saying, stop this rainbow nation stuff and focus on black natives, on the black natives. So they are saying, shift away from the class struggle and focus on the black republic. Have the black nation behind you. Look at the situation. It is saying, what is the point of pushing for a multiracial society if you don't have black people united first? But your focus on the black natives. So put your focus on the black natives first, because South Africa has uh, the racial issue. So now it gets complicated, as you can see, because now these directives are coming from Moscow, and they sparked internal conflicts and divisions within the party. So now the Communist Party never gained a wide following. Its membership peaked at about 3,000 in 3,000 in 1930, and then it declined. Nevertheless, it exerted a considerable influence on the ICU, and by 1939, it was beginning to attract several of the younger and more frustrated members of the ANC, of the APO, and the SAIC. So, and the ANC's Joshua Gumede visited the Soviet Union. He was president of the ANC in 1927, and Gumede wanted to use this opportunity to address the plight of Africans, but also to gain first-hand knowledge of communism in Russia. So at the Brussels conference, Gumede met communists, left-wing socialists, and radical nationalists, enlarging his political perspective. So after the Brussels conference, Gumede was invited to Berlin, Germany, by the German Communist Party. So on arrival there, on the 17th of February 1927, Gumede was warmly greeted by some 10,000 German communists. He attended the World Congress of the Friends of the Soviet Union from 10 to the 12th of November 1927 in Moscow. So the visit coincided with the 10-year celebration of the Bolsheviks' revolution. So Gumede was becoming more convinced and attracted to communism and developed a more radical critique of British imperialism. And so now Gumede realized that communism could play a vital role in liberating Africa. And his new ideas helped give birth to the alliance between the ANC and the CPSA. So the highlight of this visit was his meeting with Joseph Stalin on his return to South Africa on the 17th of February 1928. Gumede was given a hero's welcome in Cape Town at a combined ANC and CPSA mass meeting held in Waterkant Street. So he affirmed their alliance as both parties had at the top of the agenda African liberation. And Gumede said, when I left South Africa, I was under the impression that in Russia people were not safe. But what I saw there surprised me. I saw a new Jerusalem. I found people happy, contented, and prosperous. The government of Russia is the government of the working class. Today in Russia, the land belongs to the people. So, referring to the position of the church in Russia, Gumede denied common claims in South Africa to the effect that the Russian people were opposed to all forms of religion. Gumede praised the USSR as a country where racism was insignificant. if at all existent. Then, contrary to his previous anti-Bolshevik stance, he now pronounced the white communists in South Africa were the only group who fully supported blacks in their struggle for equal rights. So Gumede began to support an alliance with the communists. Um, Van Dymel puts the argument that Gumede's initial hostility towards communism stemmed from his perception that it threatened Zulu traditions and the status of African property owners, of which he was one. So his disappointment with Britain eventually disposed him to reach out to other potential allies, including the communists. Finally, having once supported legal means of protest, Gumede now began to push for mass action. He was ahead of his time in many ways, both because he realized the futility of constitutional protest and because he recognized the need to build a united front in the struggle against South Africa's system of racial segregation. So the CPSA increasingly turned its attention to Gumede and to the ANC after the communists were expelled from the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, right? So now we're going to look at the Bullhoek massacre. Okay, so now in 1921, on the 24th of May, in a battle lasting less than 30 minutes between the police and the Israelites, who were the followers of a prophet who was called Enoch Mgijima, more than 180 people were killed. Something interesting is it's not actually known the number of people who died, because the numbers, people will say it ranges from 150 to 200 plus, and that itself, not knowing how many people died in the Book massacre also just shows us how um, the deaths of black people did not matter and they were just not even recorded properly. So in the Eastern Cape, there was a religious group called Mgijima. There was a religious group, and Mgijima prophesied the second coming of the Lord. So the black people who were religious were called the Israelites. So Mgijima decided to call his followers Israelites as he identified with the Hebrews of the Old Testament. So the Israelites arrived at Ntabelanga to hold their Passover celebration, right? And the Israelites usually leave after Passover. However, they remained on the land after Passover and they erected houses, and there were thousands of them. So the government demanded that the Israelites move, and the local farmers at that time actually saw this as a possible land grab. So the officials in Queenstown were not actually convinced that the Israelites were peaceful. The police and the native affairs officials dealing with policies towards Africans in Pretoria told the Queenstown officials to tactfully enforce the law and persuade the Israelites to leave. So Ndabelanga at this point was a permanent settlement. It actually had streets and sturdy brick homes. So Enoch Mgijima preached to his followers the theme of redemption, the theme of bondage, of sin, the bondage of slavery. So as you can see, powerful stuff. This is the stuff he preached to his followers, the Israelites. So now, the smart government would eventually then send in troops of nearly the smart government sent in troops and nearly 200 peaceful protesters were killed and hundreds were injured. So when the Israelites entered Queenstown, um, When the Israelites then entered Queenstown after this brutality, they entered Queenstown on the Westbourne side. There were white people lined up on the road, and they were cheering, and the wounded people were driven down to Cathcart Road in carts to the hospital. So we can see that so many people were killed because they did not want to move from a particular area. And the white farmers at the time, they saw this as a possible land grab. So as you can see, this is 10 years later from the 1913 Land Act, when the 1913 Land Act had become a law. So, I mean, these were peaceful protesters as they were actually dancing and worshipping, and the apartheid police mistook this as a form of a war dance, and an order to shoot them was given. So you can see that land was a central issue in this conflict. Okay, what I want to do is I want to stretch our thinking a bit. We are critical thinkers after all, right? So when comparing Bulwark, um, maybe Marikana, yeah, Marikana, um, and these different police mass shootings from different areas, right? These are different police shootings from different areas. Um, there are different police profiles, but it's demonstrating, but all demonstrating something of political state power, assumptions along racial, class, occupational attitudes, displayed within local police culture over a century-long period. So in combination with the police's own fears and motivations. So the police at Bulhoek were, what I'm saying is, so the police at Bulhoek were overwhelmingly Anglo-African, Anglo-South Africans. Their officers virtually exclusively, so many were also First World War veterans. So and then if you look at Sharpeville, the shooters were almost definitely exclusively white Afrikaners, mainly very young, born amidst the political struggles between white South Africans and socialized during the triumphant mobilization of Afrikaner nationalism pre and post 1948, right? Where fear, distrust, rejection of black political demands were often the only common point of agreement between the Anglos and the Afrikaners. So the Marikana policemen were almost exclusively black, right? Africans. So footage shows a small sprinkling of whites. The political and service commanders were also black. So ANC political power was long confirmed, and these policemen would have grown up during the turbulent final years of the National Party rule. Ne? So they So across decades, right? Um, so across these decades, coming to my point now, so policemen of different, what can we say, languages, culture, and the different white and black governments responded exactly the same way. So at whatever the cost, the Israelites had to be dispersed back to their original homes. So the political context differs in each massacre, but in each case, the government's response is the same. It's repulsive. So the state, the ruling class, this is where I'm going with this. So the state, the ruling class, used its power to suppress a group that posed a challenge to a social order and the dominant economic system, right? And as we said, land was a central issue in the conflict, right? So the state acted um, like a tool of the ruling class to maintain control and protect the ruling class interests. Above all else, it was about control. Okay. So when we look at the South African economy, 1910 to 1939, I just want us to look at the South African economy during this period. Diamonds have been there since what, 1860s, and it is gold that dominated. So gold generated enormous wealth, mostly for English speakers, who dominated the commercial and financial sectors. So farming was dominated by Afrikaners, although in the early 1900s, larger commercial farms put less profitable Afrikaners business out of business. So the social consequence of this, in many Afrikaners refuse, the social consequence of this, many Afrikaners refuse to do common farm labor, selling their labor power to others. So they went into the city to go look for work. So they are then known, these guys are then known as the poor whites. They are largely unskilled, they are poorly educated, and sometimes competing for jobs with blacks, which is obviously and which is obviously a Afrikaner political issue. So the government can't ignore these Afrikaner votes, right? So they introduce laws like job reservations, artificial wage levels for whites, and the government subsidizes to keep poor whites going. All of this is done at the expense of who? At the expense of blacks. So now, this is a table here of the segregation laws in the past system. So there were many segregation laws that were introduced. These are just a few key ones. So this system was implemented to enforce racial separation and to control the movement of black people. So one of the key components of the system was the pass system. The new gold mines on the Rand wanted cheap, unskilled labor. So this connects to the migrant labor system. Black people were forced to go seek work outside the reserves. The law made it impossible for black people to settle where they worked. So these men lived in single quarters. They would save money for their families. So black people coming in town had to get a permit. They had to carry it everywhere they went and had to be ready to show it on demand or they'd get arrested. So black people would stand in these long queues to get a permit, and they were stopped several times a day and were asked to give these permits. And if you had left it at home or in another piece of clothing item, you would go straight to jail. So the pass system, it formed the basis of the struggle. So now we're going to look at the 1913 Women's Anti-Pass campaign in the Orange Free State. So the first people to resist the pass laws were women from the Orange Free State. So since Bloemfontein's founding in 1846, the Cape Town Council and the majority of the town's white residents argued that all people of color, whether they were born in Bloemfontein or not, were not true citizens of the town, but merely servants of the townspeople. So it boiled down to the principle that black and colored people were only tolerated in the so-called locations as long as they were useful to the whites. So in other words, Bloemfontein's racially segregated locations, notably Vryhoek and the oldest and biggest location by far, but also the smaller ones such as Garfontein and Cape Strands, were considered the exclusive living areas of Bloemfontein's servant class. So to obtain control over the movement of Bloemfontein's location residents and also to ensure a steady supply of cheap domestic and other types of labor for Bloemfontein's whites, the council felt compelled to introduce the pass laws. So these laws, which were first made effective in 1891, so since the past laws were introduced for the first time during the early 1890s, Bloemfontein's black residents had peacefully protested the measures, but to no avail. So after the war, black people used existing political organizations as vehicles of protest, such as the Cape Town-based African Political Organization, the Cape Town-based APO, and the local Native Vigilance Committee, which became the Orange River Colony Native Congress during the colonial period 1902 to 1910. So the petitions with a request to repeal women's passes were sent to, amongst others, the mayor of Bloemfontein. So Lady Gladstone, the wife of the Governor General, um, this did not yield any positive responses. So this was sent, as I said, to the mayor, Bloemfontein, to Lady Gladstone, and this was even sent to the King Edward. So the founding of the South African Native National Congress, we spoke about it earlier, the SANNC in January 1912 in Bloemfontein, not only brought the women new hope, but this historic event also inspired them to take up their grievances with renewed vigor. So the women's resolve to tackle the past issue head on was further strengthened by their presence at the proceedings um, of Charlotte Mxeke, a learned black woman who was elected to the SANNC executive. So to demonstrate to the authorities the extent of women's dissatisfaction with the past laws, the police behavior an anti-pass law petition was widely circulated throughout the Orange Free State. It was signed by more than 5,000 women. This petition was taken to Cape Town by a delegation of 6 Waiwook women and handed to the Minister of Native Affairs, Henry Burton. So now the delegation included the Waiwook women who had by then emerged as the leaders of the anti-pass law campaigns, such as Cathy Lowe, the Anglican minister's daughter, and Mrs. A.S. Tabashane. So women gave a leading fight in fighting these past laws. They were harassed, they were arrested, and the newly formed Bantu Women's League, with Charlotte Mxeke as its first president, there was the Orange Free State Native and Colored Women's Association, led by Katie Lowe and Katharina Simons. They organized a mass meeting in Waiwook on the 28th of May 1913. At the meeting, the women declared their unwillingness to carry passes any longer, and subsequently, about 200 of them, reportedly led by Charlotte Mxeke, marched to the mayor, who was Evan Harburger's office in town, to inform him of their decision. So since the mayor was not available, the women returned to Waiwook, and that night a crowd of them gathered at the local police station where they tore up their passes. Okay, so over the following 2 days, more than 80 women were arrested and charged for not having passes. So the women continued to march. The Waiwook Women's Anti-Pass campaign and the subsequent violent arrests made headings throughout the Orange Free State. In some towns such as Wynberg, Jagersfontein, Barrismith, similar protests were held. So black and even some white women who sympathized with their domestic servants' plight, they wore blue ribbons and rosettes as a sign of their participation and support. So the extensive media coverage given to the women's anti-pass protest, it actually put pressure on the national government in Cape Town to respond to the Waiwook women's grievances. The women only won a complete victory in 1923 when women of color were excluded from the pass laws on a national basis. So although the government's concession lasted only for a season and was in fact reversed after 1948, the Waiwook women demonstrated what could be achieved when women voiced their demands in unity with resolve. So now we're going to look at the Great Depression in the 1930s, okay? So the Great Depression in the years of 1932, 1934, there was a serious drought that afflicted many parts of the country, and it absolutely devastated communities. So it was called the Great Depression. These were the hunger years. Um, there was a hunger march in Durban in 1931. People were hungry. Um, soup kitchens were established, and black and white people flooded into towns. What are you going to do? You're going to sell your labor if you're starving, right? So, on the onset of the Great Depression, it brought about considerable political change, right? So, Herzog, whose national party had won the 1929 elections, after splitting with the Labour Party, received much of the blame for the devastating economic impact of the Depression. So, fearing electoral defeat in the next elections of 1934, he sought a partnership with his former opponent, Jan Smuts, and the latter's South African Party. So now in 1933, Herzog and Smuts made an alliance, and in the following years, they merged their two parties to form the United South African National Party, also known as the United Party. Herzog and Smuts they won the general election. So Herzog continued as prime minister and Smuts became his deputy. Many Afrikaners criticized Herzog's move, especially because they considered Smuts to be an opponent of Afrikaner nationalism, who was too closely aligned with the English mine owners, and under the leadership of D.F. Malan and the Broederbond, they split away to form their own political parties, the Purified National Party. So now Malan built his own political appeal by stressing, this is what Malan stressed, he stressed the particular suffering of the Afrikaner people. So their economic problems had become especially evident during the Depression when the Carnegie Commission of Poor Whites had concluded in 1931 that nearly one-third of Afrikaners lived as paupers, whereas few English-speaking whites lived below the poverty line. So to deal with this problem, Malan and his allies in the Bond encouraged the development of an Afrikaner economic movement. So the Afrikaner Broederbond was inspired to raise funds for the poor urban Afrikaners. So every small Afrikaner family was asked to make a small contribution to the material welfare to building up a little trust fund, some form of support for the Afrikaner people. So now in 1938, they celebrated the 100th year of the Great Trek. Like their forefathers, they made the long journey from the Cape to Pretoria in Boksburg. So the aim of the trek was to unite all Afrikaners. When they got there, they chanted "Freedom, Freedom, British Empire." In 1938, there was a reenactment of the Battle of Blood River. It played a role in the process of Afrikaner nationalism, leading to the victory of the Nationalist Party in 1948. So it was an enormous upsurge of national pride. It brought back old culture and religious values of Afrikaner people. So at the end of the track, the National Party leader Malan told his followers that it was now the duty of the Afrikaner to make South Africa a white man's land. So now When we look at the ANC 1930 to 1939, so the ANC was plowed by divisions and factionalism, evidenced by the frequency of change in its leadership. So a split of the Cape branch of the ANC led to the formation of the independent ANC. So Pixley succeeded Joshua Kumede as President General on the 30th of April 1930. Then there was Reverend R. Mahabane replaced Kumede as President General in 1937, and in 1940 Mahabe was replaced by A.B. Krumah, and during this period the ICU it declined, right? So in the 30s, the influence of the ANC declined, mainly due to its ineffectiveness of the organization, opposing factions within the groups, leadership disputes, and the failures of representations to the government to remove the grievances of blacks. So one camp in the ANC started talking more about action. Okay, and those who were taking the Christian ethic condemned this. This was the beginning of the contradictions within the national movement now. So during the war years, the African National Congress formed political alliances with the colored and the Indian organizations. So by the end of the war, the ANC Youth League had been established within the ANC. It demanded the program of exclusively black nationalism. So they believed in the Pan-Africanism approach, right? So the Youth League held that blacks should develop the same racial awareness and racial solidarity as did white South Africans. So these ideologies later led to the creation of the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC. Okay, we're going to stop here and we are going to carry on with we're going to carry on in the next recording for the third part of this lecture. Thank you for listening.